This is the podcast for Narrate Church. Narrate Church meets every Sunday at 9 and 11 a.m. at the Grand Street Theater in Helena, Montana. For more information, visit www.narratechurch.org.
If you're a guest with us, welcome. We're delighted that you're here, honored. We are a church, as you probably know, and our bent is we want to gather and we want to scatter. We're convinced that Jesus is who he says that he is, and as we wrestle with what does that mean and how do we flesh that out, we're constantly trying to remind ourselves that gathering like this is integral. It has a strategic role, plays a strategic role in helping us explore who Jesus is and wrestle with what his dreams for the world really are. And yet, this is 1/7 of the week. And so part of the goal of this, part of the way we evaluate this is to the degree that it provokes us and stimulates us to enter into those other 6 days with a different perspective, with a different passion, with a different desire as we enter home and work and school and neighborhoods. Really with a serving towel over our arm, because we think that Jesus narrated a better story by serving others, and so that's kind of our bent. To that end, those of you that were a part of the Hope for Haiti race yesterday, thank you. Way to go. It was fantastic. I'm told I couldn't make it because I was busy coaching my son's flag football team, which got their butts kicked. If anybody would like to coach flag football, I'm taking applications and resigning my post. I'm tired of disappointing third grade children with my poor offensive schemes. So defense is just fine. The Wonger's taking care of the defense and we're doing well, but unfortunately the only way we have a chance of winning is with pick sixes and fumble recoveries. So seriously, if you'd like to coach flag football, but I digress. Jack Oberweiser, professor over at Carroll College, who's become a friend of Narrate's, and we think of who in our community. And by that, we're constantly going it's about who, not what. And our understanding of Jack is that he's one of the best, and we think one of the best missionaries, so to speak, in our community. And so we, along with a Narrate businessman, got behind him and sponsored the t-shirts for that race, and then many of you helped volunteer and ran in the race. And so thanks, good job. I heard some positive feedback from some of you that ran, and he texted me and just, once again was like, thank you. So it was really, really fun. I love the message that we send when we strategically partner with a Catholic university. I think Jesus smiles at that, so you should be proud of yourself for being a part of that. Good job. Okay, I'd like to pray, and we're going to jump into some things. We're going to take several different angles. You'll mostly be confused, but hopefully you'll have enjoyed the music this morning. So let me pray, and we'll hope for better. God, thanks for your word. Thanks for truth. Thanks for science. And in this series, I'm just constantly grateful for the way that science confirms what you've been saying for thousands of years, and what you've been saying for thousands of years helps us elevate some current scientific research and understanding. So we're grateful, and would you help us leave this morning transformed, well aware of the fact that to follow you isn't just about what goes on between our ears, but it often does start there. We love you. Amen. There's a boy named Josh. He was a real boy, kind of like Pinocchio, but it's not really what I had in mind when I was thinking about how I would start that story. But I couldn't pronounce his last name, so I just cut it. But there was a boy named Josh who lived in a large city, and this was a couple decades ago, I suppose several decades ago now. And when he was 6 years old, he and his mom were walking through a large park en route to the playground. He had his eye on the monkey bars. But as he walked through the park, he passed a section of the park that was dedicated to the public playing of chess. And like how we have those tables all over our parks, they had them in their park too, where there's those concrete, that was sarcastic, but those concrete tables with chessboards, and there were people sitting behind them playing chess and pieces on top. And as he walked by, there was an elderly gentleman sitting on one side of one of those tables, pieces on the board, but nobody sitting on the other side. And Josh almost instinctively just stopped and looked at him and said, "You want to play?" Before the gentleman could answer, the mom jumped in, right moms, you can relate, and she was embarrassed, and she was apologizing, and she was tripping over herself, saying, I don't know why he asked you that. He's never seen a chessboard. He's certainly never played chess before. Sorry. And the man just knew that eventually she had to breathe, so he just kind of waited. And when she did breathe, he said, "Well, could I teach him?" And she looked at her son, and Josh had this eager look on his face, and she said, "Sure." And Josh sat down. And the man just took a couple minutes to explain each of the different pieces in chess and the different maneuvers that they could legally make, and said, "Okay, let's play, and we'll just kind of talk about it as we go." And as Josh would say decades later, having got that brief explanation, he began to look at the chessboard, and it was as though he'd played chess his entire life. He said he could instantly see moves and strategies. And so this game began, and within a couple of minutes, a crowd had gathered around this table because there were these whispers of like, this kid is going to beat this guy, and he was one of the best players in the park, and he's never played before, and people just watched. Turned out that Josh was a prodigy, that he was a phenom. In the coming weeks and months, he returned to the park as frequently as he could and learned the aggressive tactics of the wily veterans in his local park. At age 7, a gentleman had approached his father, Josh's dad, and suggested that he enroll Josh in a more classical training, lest he be corrupted by these park players and their unsophisticated play. And so Josh's dad acquiesced and hired a teacher who he then began to study under. From the ages from 7 on, Josh won one tournament after another, earned one title after another. At the age of 11, he was invited to play the world champion of chess. He didn't win, but he was 11 years old. Now, this teacher was a very exacting sort, a very demanding sort, and he was a little disgusted by this park player's style of play. He was more interested in a very formulaic way of playing. Complex formulas involved an endless series of moves. He was teaching him how to be able to look at the board and see the pieces where they are and be able to forecast where the pieces could be in, say, 20 moves. And that was working for Josh until one day something happened where he was sitting in a tournament and a key moment came up and his brain just froze. He would later say that there was so much stuff jammed in his head that it was like he could remember nothing. And he just stared at the board. And this happened again and again, and his progress seemed to completely fall off the table. And eventually his instructor came to understand what was going on, and he went about teaching Josh a better strategy, how to respond to this like way complex thing going on in his head. Seeing an empty board, like how could that possibly be helpful, right? What Josh explains as an adult, that he understands that in that moment, having been taught how to clear his thinking and see an empty board, he says he learned the most important strategy he would need to becoming a champion. That in doing so, he would once again leverage his strength that he had when he was 6 years old, the strength of his mind. Now, the conversation that I want to provoke for our remaining time this morning deals with this idea of what if the same is true of you and me? What if the same is true for us? Like what if it's possible to so overanalyze, so overthink that we actually weaken ourselves? We've had lots of conversations about the importance of using our mind. What if you can overuse it? And what if thinking too much actually causes you to use your mind less effectively? Now, if you weren't with us last week, we started a series called Mind, Heart, and Soul, and really the jumping off point of that series, and I think it was more a confession than anything, was this acknowledgement of like, Lord, sometimes I'm not sure I'm strong enough. Like, I'm not sure I have what it takes to live the life you're calling me to live. Lord, sometimes whatever it is inside of a person that makes them strong, Lord, faith, courage, whatever you want to call that, sometimes I'm not sure that I have that. And where we went in the text was to Matthew 22, where Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And as we pointed out last week, this is a text that is much covered, and it should be. I mean, this is the Jesus Creed. This is the core of what he believes. He's stepping inside a rabbinic tradition where guys were constantly asked, simplify your teaching, and he simplified it by saying, love God, love teachers. I'm not sure, love God, love neighbor. I'm not sure if you're distracted by that, but I am. And really what we talked about last week was this idea of love God with your mind, heart, soul. We can generalize that and say, like, love God with everything you got. And that gist does it a great justice. But what if Jesus differentiates a person having a heart and a mind and a soul for a reason? What if he doesn't want it generalized? What if he is a master technician at living, at what it means to be human, and he understands that a person who's going to love God and love people well will need to be well in their heart and in their soul and in their mind? So that's kind of the series that we're in. What I want to talk about this morning is what does it look like to love God with your mind? And really where I want to start this week, and we'll continue in the coming weeks, is like what if it starts by learning to think more simply? What if when our thinking becomes too complex, that's a bad thing? Now, if you've followed Jesus for a while, then probably like me, you've had lots of conversations in your time of following Jesus that deal with the mind and how important it is to protect what gets into your mind and how important it is to feed your mind and how incredible of a resource it is to help you connect with God. And Christ followers are very good at talking about the mind and all the things we ought to do with it and the things we ought not to do with it. Here's what was new to me as I studied this, and here's why it just, for me personally, was quite impactful, is if we're going to think in a pendulum line of thinking, what if that conversation about how to use our mind is important, but what if there's another conversation that's just as important about not overusing our mind? Like what if there's a spectrum, and inside that spectrum is healthy thinking, but it's quite possible to not think enough, and it's equally as possible to think far too much. And I guess the jumping off point for me is, if I understand Narrate and who we are, I don't think this over here is a problem for us. I suspect that most of you are quite adept at thinking. So much so that maybe what we need to work on is, when am I thinking too much? My favorite Christmas treat growing up was pretzels dipped in white almond bark. Anybody else? Sprinkles on top, right? And then, I don't know when it was, I suspect it was shortly after I graduated, I discovered that you could buy white almond bark any time of the year, that you didn't have to just wait for Christmas to have these. And so I bought some, and I took it home, and I quickly read the directions, because that's what I do, is I quickly read directions, and I threw it in the pot, and I got out my pretzels, and it melted, and I started dipping pretzels in there, and I think I dipped about 3, and then it started to get hard again. Like, it started to get chunky, and I was like, weird, I didn't realize that, I needed to turn the heat up once it melted, and so I turned the heat up a little more, and it was getting more and more chunky. And long story short, I got about 5 pretzels done, because what happened? It became hard again, like a rock. There's a continuum, right? Like, if you've ever tried to cook with milk or milk chocolate, you know it starts solid, and then it becomes liquid, but then it can become too hot. That's my stupid illustration of what I'm trying to say this morning. What if thinking happens that way? That there's this ideal place, and too little is a bad thing, yes, but too much is also a bad thing. Because overthinking, that can be triggered. You don't even have to get out of bed to have overthinking triggered, do you? An email, like there's this one sentence in an email, this look that a boss gives you, a friend gives you, a spouse gives you, this invitation that isn't accepted, this invitation that is accepted. I mean, we are such complex creatures. There's these things that are said, an upcoming doctor's appointment. Like, overthinking is quite easy, right? And then there's the relational part. Like, I'll bet you every person in this story could tell a story, every person in this room could tell a story about a conflict where a relationship started deteriorating and you didn't quite understand what was going on in the relationship. And then finally, like 3 months or 6 months or 9 months later, you went like, okay, what is wrong? And the person needed like 3 hours to explain what was wrong. And what was wrong was this big, long narrative, and it had all these complexities and all these things going on. But after the 3 hours were over and you heard the story, it started with this email you sent, and you don't even remember sending it. And you certainly didn't mean that by it. But in the process of that, they so misinterpreted what you said, that this giant grand narrative occurred. Can you relate to that? So something happens, and we ruminate, and we think about it, and we process it, and we create these alternative endings. And really the question is that helpful? Because what we think we're doing is bringing fresh perspective, right? What if we're not? Well, what if we're actually bringing cloudiness? Have you ever, look at this. I got it from Lenny's office, as you might imagine. Okay, this is a really gross oversimplification of the brain, but what I've had the privilege of doing this week is, in the last couple months actually, is studying some of the neuroscience behind some of this stuff. So I'm just going to so grossly oversimplify it. But let's just say your brain has 2 halves, which it does, but like that's accurate. But what I'm about to say is only kind of accurate, because there's these 2 thinking centers. So have you ever got to the point where you go like, my brain hurts? Like, I'm so tired, my brain hurts. Or have you ever got to the point where you've thought so much about something that you're physically exhausted? There's a real simple physiological explanation to that. It's because your brain, it needs sugar, right? There's a more technical term for it, but for me, I just go with sugar because I don't understand science all that well. It needs energy. And when your brain, when you think things, when your processing center, your verbal processing center goes into hyperdrive, it uses all the energy. It becomes a ball hog. It doesn't pass energy to anybody else, which is why your brain starts to hurt, because it's tired. And the reason you get physically exhausted when you think too much is because the rest of your body has been deprived of energy. So there's these two parts. And this is kind of on the foundation of everything we're going to talk about this morning. You have a verbal processing center. That's not at all accurate, but and you have what you might call an intuitive processing center. And when you think and overthink, then what happens is you allow the verbal processing center to get hit into hyperdrive, and the intuitive center does nothing. It doesn't get to contribute. And yet what science tells us is there's a lot of wisdom from past experience, from other people's experience, from things that you've learned. There's a lot in there, but when you're thinking actively, it doesn't get to contribute. Some of you may remember a name, Chichi Rodriguez. Anybody remember Chichi Rodriguez? I remember him growing up watching golf with my grandpa when it wasn't football season. Chichi Rodriguez is this pretty, what would you call him, charismatic guy, very fun to watch, and yet his legacy is that he was a phenomenal golfer who couldn't putt, terrible on the putting green. In fact, he frequently says, even today publicly, that if he could putt, you would have never heard of Arnold Palmer. So in other words, if you could putt, then when you had that iced tea lemonade thing, you would call it a Chichi. So like a pet name, Chichi. But here's what happened. The reality is, what Chichi says is there was a time in his life where he could putt. In fact, early in his career, he was pretty good at it. And then a reporter asked him, how do you putt? Like, what do you think about? What do you do when you putt? Like, what makes you a successful putter? And he couldn't answer the question. And it disturbed him that he couldn't offer an intelligent answer to that question. And so he started thinking about it. And over the next few weeks, he developed this complex explanation for how he went into putting. He was able to answer the reporters after that. And I kid you not, you can look it up. And he says, I haven't been able to putt since. What do we call that? Well, paralysis by analysis, perhaps? Sports psychologists study this a lot. And what they say, this is why I had this post-it note, what it's called is verbal overshadowing. That your verbal processing center is going so fast that nothing else gets to work. And yet what guys like Les Parrott say, these experts in this field, what they say is if you will slow the verbal processing center down, the intuitive center has incredible wisdom to offer. But you have to slow that part down, which I would submit to you sounds an awful lot like something James said some 2,000 years ago, when he said in the opening lines of one of the most straightforward books, some have called it the 2x4 of the New Testament, one of the most straightforward books in all of the Bible, he says in James 1:5, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it'll be given to you. Like, what is James saying? Is he not confessing that there's a type of insight, there's a type of wisdom that you can't calculate, and you won't land upon it by your critical thinking skills. You won't get there by intense analysis. There's a type of wisdom. James says it comes only from God. Science says it comes only if you still your active mind enough to let the other parts of your mind work. Those of you that like to run, like we have this term called a runner's high. Is it not when you get to the place where suddenly, like, you're just kind of unconscious? In fact, I've said before, like, my favorite times with God over the last several years are when I'm running. Why? Or maybe when you're on a bike, or maybe you're someone that likes to go for long drives. I don't know what that is for you, but I would challenge you, isn't that what happens? That you get this place where you stop thinking, which sounds counterintuitive, but it's in those moments where you're more dialed into God's voice than any other time. Which raises this question, like, what if God speaks to us through our intuitive mind? There's this researcher, Gary Klein, and he was a cognitive psychologist, and his interest was how do people who respond, who work in unpredictable circumstances and are constantly facing life and death decisions, those that make them well, how do they do it? I know that was a terrible question, but you get the gist of it, right? If you think about it for 5 minutes. Right? Like what they were wondering is, like, say, an ER doctor. They can't predict what they're going to face in any given day. So how is it when the situation walks in the door and there's life and death decisions to be made, why are they so good at it? One of the guys he studied where one of the situations involved an IndyCar race. It was a road race, and there was this terrible multi-car crash around a blind corner, like a hairpin corner. People were literally dying in the crash. And there was an IndyCar driver who was coming up on that corner at almost 200 miles an hour, and by all accounts, should have went through that corner at just a little less than 200 miles an hour. There was no signs put up, nothing going on. Had he went around the corner the way the race was designed for him to go around the corner, he couldn't see the crash. Had he done it the way he should do it, he too would have died. Nobody on the corner was holding signs. Nobody was saying anything. Nobody across the radio said a word. And yet, intuitively, he slowed down and came to a stop. Why? Well, what Gary Klein found was that he learned how to leverage his intuitive center, that he wasn't so overthinking every decision that there was room for his intuitive brain to work. Another situation involved this lieutenant in Cleveland, Ohio, who was remarkable. He was a fireman, and he was remarkable at responding to emergency situations. So there was a situation, and Gary Klein was spending several days at work with him. A call came in. What they knew was there was a guy unconscious in a front yard in a pool of blood, lying face down. They were the first ones on the scene. The lieutenant got out of the ambulance, fire truck, whatever, looked, saw a ladder, a broken front window, a man laying face down in a pool of blood, quickly discerned he must have fallen off the ladder, stuck his arm through the window, severed some kind of major artery, was now bleeding to death. Immediately looked at the guys with him and said, load him up on the gurney and get him in the ambulance. They say he got to the ambulance or to the hospital within just moments of losing his life. He was bleeding to death. But all training said, well, first he should figure out if his spine is injured. And then, recognizing that he's probably bleeding to death, there should have been these specialized pants put on him that they would help regulate his blood pressure. And then he should be loaded onto a hospital gurney, or a gurney, and taken to the hospital. But by all accounts, he would have died had they done that. Gary Klein asked this guy, so what did you do? Like, I don't understand it. Are you rogue? Do you not like authority? Like, is that just the way you do things? Is you don't follow the rules? What's the deal? He said, when I get into those situations, I try not to get caught up in asking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I try not to zoom way in, and I try to zoom way out and go, what's going on here? What if that's what it looks like to use our minds to love God? What if when we go like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? We lose the ability to follow Jesus. What if instead what we need to do is zoom out and go, God, what are you doing here? What's the big picture before I get caught up in all the minutia of the situation? And what if hearing the still small voice of God, right? Like the psalmist so famously wrote, "Be still and know that I'm God." I mean, does that refer to physical movement? What does that refer to? Could it be that it refers to this very idea that if you think too fast, if your brain isn't still, it'll seem as though there is no God because you're so quick trying to figure everything out that you'll be the only influence in the formula? Scientists know, they've studied this, that when a person puts their mind on God, when they think upon God intentionally, over time, your physical brain changes, literally. Like when energy is invested to connect with God mentally, your brain is altered. Which makes me think that perhaps what Paul said in Romans 12 isn't just a metaphor. You remember when he said in Romans 12:2, in response to this profound teaching of Romans about God and his grace and the fact that we can't earn it, and just these marvelous, incredibly complex, and yet beautiful explanation of the cross, Paul says, okay, so how do we respond to that? Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. That's what I love about living when we live. That 2,000 years ago, God says, well, how do you do this? Well, your mind needs to change. And yet science would say, hey, guess what? That wasn't just a metaphor. Like physiologically, it needs to change. What if God speaks to us through our intuitive brain? And if that's true, then it would require that we have the ability to still the other part, right? The part that wants to problem solve, the part that wants to figure everything out, the part that has to have solutions and have them now. What if loving God with our minds involves a discipline of going, you know what? I've thought about this situation. I am physically tired for having tried to figure this situation out. And it's not getting me anywhere. What if realizing the strength that you have because you have a mind, what if part of what Jesus is getting at is, hey, you can't really trust God if you're always calculating the answer? If you're uncomfortable with the lack of text, I am too this week. And the best I could do in my own wrestling with God is to go, I don't think it's any more complex than James 1:5. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it'll be given to you. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be people who use our minds. I'm speculating that we're people that may use them too much. And that sometimes hearing from God, sometimes loving God with our minds, sometimes realizing the strength available to us, sometimes the reason we feel weak is because we're thinking too much. And sometimes the most Christ-centered response is to very humbly turn and go, God, I don't know. And I'm going to stop thinking about it. And I'm going to beg you for wisdom. Wisdom that draws upon past experience, wisdom that deals with the way my brain processes and stores and remembers information. Wisdom, God, that you speak to me. And some people will think I'm foolish. But God, I'm going to surrender and go, God, I need wisdom here. I don't know what problem you're trying to solve. I don't know what issue you're dealing with, whether it deals with work or a relationship or even an idea. My challenge to you, and I'm hoping it's a little counterintuitive and provoking, therefore, is what if the answer is sometimes not thinking so much and instead turning and going, Lord, I need your help. Would you give it to me? Whether that's the confirmation of another person, whatever that is, Lord. I don't know what problem you're dealing with. What if loving God with your mind involves simplifying your thinking? I'd like to pray, and we're going to sing a little bit before we're done. God, in some ways, it feels silly even to talk about the mind because it's such a reminder of how finite we are and so how incredibly infinite you are. The degree to which we understand it is so minimal. And yet, God, I have no doubt that every one of us here can relate to thinking too much. Thinking way too much. God, if it's true that you were being very specific when you said to love you with our minds, with that unique part of our personhood, would you teach us how to be a people who can be still, who can wait on answers from you, who can zoom out and not get caught up in the details, but ask you to help us see the bigger picture. God, for friends that are exploring you and what you're like, I pray that like those friends that are walking with them, you'll give them words and really good ears, that they would continue to find safe places to explore your Son and the cross and grace. And for people who are ready to commit themselves to you, that you'd give them safe ways to communicate that to you as well. Amen.
For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app for Android and coming soon to the iTunes Store.